want to sew more with the knits but only have a regular sewing machine, you might wonder, do I need to invest in a serger or perhaps even a cover stitch machine? No, you don't have to. And in this video I will share my top tips on how to achieve really great results even if you have a very basic regular sewing machine. So the first thing you probably need to figure out is how to pick the right type of stitches if you only have a regular sewing machine. Now for the side seams, you have usually two different options on your machine. First of all, you will have the overlock stitch. And the sewing machine overlock seams looks quite similar to the overlock stitch on a serger. So what the regular sewing machine stitch does is that it covers the edges, it has fantastic stretch, and it's also very durable seam. And the seam allowance is around 5 to 6 millimeter, which is, I think, is about 1/4 of an inch. So it usually have the same type of seam width as a serger overlock stitch as well. So that's a really good option to try. And even if you have an older sewing machine, like mine is from, I think it's 1989 or something like that, it has several of those overlock stitches. So you don't need to go out and buy a fancy machine just to get access to those overlock stitches. Now, before we say, "Jay, I don't need to get a serger," there are a few disadvantages using the sewing machine overlock stitch. Now, the first one is that it's almost impossible to rip because it goes back and forth, sewing many little different stitches that create that durable stretchy seam. But if you want to rip it up, you're going to have lots of issues, especially if you're sewing like delicate fabric. I can almost guarantee you that you will get holes in the fabric. So make sure that you have really checked and double checked everything. For instance, that the fit is right and that you are sewing together the right pieces. For instance, don't make the mistake of sewing one reverse side to one right side. A tip here is to label the fabric with a little bit of freezer tape where you say F for front, or for instance. So if you're in a hurry and you're sewing, you will ensure that you're actually sewing the right sides together, not one wrong and one right side, which can of course happens sometimes. Again, also check the sleeves and everything like that. And another disadvantage with this is because the sewing machine will sew a little bit front and back when you're using this stitch. And that means that there's a little risk that the fabric will get a bit stretched out and wobbly. So you need to make sure that you're actually controlling the fabric. You can use your hands and just gently feed it. So don't stretch it out when you're sewing, and also don't be impatient because this stitch takes quite a long time to sew, hence the durability. Another tip to prevent this, if your sewing machine has the ability to adjust the presser foot pressure, mine unfortunately doesn't, but most sewing machines will have that option, at least the modern ones, is to try to reduce the pressure of the pressure foot, because if it's too hard, the pressure, it's going to force the fabric, and that's another reason why your seam might stretch out. But you don't need to use an overlock seam to sew together side seams on stretchy knits. Instead, you can also use the narrow zigzag stitch. Now that's just a regular zigzag stitch where you have decreased the stitch width. So it looks a little bit more like a straight stitch, but it still has some give, which is very important when you're sewing knits because you need to preserve some stretch. So you can either just use the zigzag stitch, the narrow zigzag stitch, sew a straight line, and then you can press the seam open if you like, depending on the fabric. And if you want to mimic the overlock stitch that I mentioned previously, you can also sew a second row of a regular zigzag stitch over the edges. So you're basically creating an overlock stitch with enclosed seams. So that's another tip. You can definitely check that out. Sometimes it's easier and also much easier to rip. And now we just talked about side seams, but of course you also want to hem your garment, and you have at least 3 options on most sewing machines that are really good for hemming knits. So again, you don't need to invest in a special cover stitch machine, which is the more professional way of doing it. On pretty much every sewing machine, you will have several different options to use when you want to hem knits. Now, my first tip is to use the twin needle seam, which is 2 rows of straight stitches on the right side of the fabric, and on the reverse side, on the inside, you're going to have a zigzag stitch joining them together. So that's my number 1 tip. Another tip that I find that I use a lot, but I don't see it recommended in many other spaces, is to use the blind hem stitch on your sewing machine, because every sewing machine will have a blind hem stitch, which a blind hem stitch is a stitch that is pretty invisible on the right side, the more you do it, the more invisible it gets. It basically just catches, every third stitch catches the inside of the fabric. So there are usually 1 or 2 different blind hem stitches on your regular sewing machine. If you're using a rather stable fabric, like a French terry or a sweatshirt knit fabric, that you can use the regular blind hem stitch, which is also done for woven fabrics. It sews a couple of straight stitches, then a zigzag stitch that joins the inside of the fabric, and then it sews a couple of straight stitches. And that creates enough stretch if your fabric isn't super stretchy. And if your fabric is more stretchy, you can also see if your sewing machine has the other option, which is a stretch blind hem stitch. So instead of the straight stitches between those wide zigzag stitch, you will have zigzag stitches. So that means that the fabric can stretch out much more without the seams breaking. And the blind hem stitch I find is absolutely fantastic, but there are a few things to consider. Now, first of all, you cannot use this for a very lightweight fabric. So it's best suited for more stable, thicker fabric. If you have a double-faced knit fabric, or for instance, if you're sewing a French terry, you have those little loops on the inside. They're also great for catching it. So you need to pick your right type of fabric when sewing a blind hem stitch. And again, make sure that you use a matching thread, because you might not be 100% able to do invisible stitching your first try. I also use a magnifying lamp because that helps me a lot. Just make sure that I really can see up close. And you also might need to adjust the stitch width to make sure that it doesn't catch too much fabric or too little fabric. Now, both these hemming techniques that I'm talking about, I've done videos about those, both for the twin needle and the blind hem stitch. So you can definitely hop over to that after you've watched this video to learn more in the details, how to really nail the settings, and lots of different tips that I'm not sharing in this video because we're going to talk so much else that comes into using a sewing machine for sewing knits. So let's talk about best thread to use when you're sewing knits on your sewing machine. Now, you can use regular universal polyester sewing machine thread and you will be really happy with the result. But if you have some issues, or perhaps the stitches is breaking and you just want to level up the finish, I do recommend that you check out what I'm holding in my hand now, which is stretch thread made for sewing machines. So this thread actually has a little bit inbuilt stretch, which is awesome. So that will minimize the risk for the seams to pop. So if you are having some type of issues, you can definitely check out. In my hand here, I'm holding the Metal brand. I know there are also some other options to check out. I'm not saying it's necessary, but it can definitely be helpful. Now, the biggest advantage with using a sewing machine compared to a serger or a cover stitch machine is the fact that you cannot regulate the speed of the feed dogs, which means that there's a risk always, especially if the fabric is soft and very stretchy, that during sewing, the fabric will stretch out and become a little bit wobbly, a little bit wavy. It doesn't look as nice as you want it, right? I think everyone will have encountered that sooner or later if you're just using a sewing machine. But there are a few hacks that can actually make the result better, perhaps not 100%, but really much better. So first of all, as I mentioned previously, you can reduce the presser foot pressure, because if the presser foot is not pushing the fabric as hard, there's a less risk that the fabric will stretch out. Another thing that is very helpful is to control the fabric. And that means that you are not stretching out the fabric, because there's a risk always that especially the upper layer will be pushed forward when you're hemming, for instance, knits. So what I do is that I use a sharp tool. I'm holding an awl in my hand, but you can use lots of different tools. And what you do with the awl is that you gently press the upper layer towards the presser foot when you're sewing. And I know it sounds really weird, but if you see this in action and you try it yourself, you will understand. Another thing you can try is to use something that's usually referred to as Wonder Tape, which is basically a water-soluble wash-away tape, double-sided. So you can use that, for instance, when you're hemming fabric and you're having this problem that I just mentioned, that the fabric grows and stretches out because the tape is rigid. So when you're stitching over it, it will keep all the layers in check. And then you wash it away, voila, the tape is gone, and the seam looks wonderful. So that's a really nice tip to try. Another tip to try is to use stretch fusible interfacing. To use that, for instance, when you're stabilizing pockets, hems, if you're having lots of issues, I do recommend that you use this. And by the way, I've done a video about this particular topic as well that you can check out to learn more about the different type of fusibles to use when you're sewing with knits. But especially on a sewing machine, using those fusible fabrics at the right instance can be a real game changer. So I'm a big fan of using that. So definitely check that out to learn more on how to really get a nice finish without stretched out seam. So I hope that I've given you some new ideas to try when you're using a regular sewing machine. Now, of course, I totally understand if you want to get a serger or a cover stitch machine. I have those myself and I love them for sewing with knits, but they're also really, really expensive. So that's why I definitely recommend that you first use the tips I'm talking about in this video. See, maybe that's enough for you. You don't need to invest in all those other machines. So I hope that you found this video useful. Stitch safe, and I talk to you soon. Bye bye.